So we are back here. Hello, Daniel. He is our next presenter. So Daniel is a software engineer and professional developer, mentor from Barcelona. He's currently working at Tempus Labs. He has about 15 years of experience in companies such as Adventia, Typeform, or King. He has been focusing on developing web applications with JavaScript and React during the last 5 years. And he has a passion about games, reading manga, and watching Netflix, as right now all of us. So thank you very much, Daniel. Go ahead.
Hello, thank you very much for having me here. I'm going to start my talk. My talk is about React hooks and my experience after 1 year using them. So, sorry, let me introduce myself again. I'm Danny, I'm a software engineer, and I've been developing web apps for almost 15 years. And I'm working now at Tempus Labs. Tempus Labs is a data-driven precision medicine company with the world's largest database of clinical data. Basically, we enable physicians to make real-time data-driven decisions to deliver personalized patient care for patients with cancer, but we are going to start studying, for example, depression or other diseases. Also, we are hiring for our offices in Barcelona and Chicago. And if you find us interesting and want to know more details, just get in touch with me after my talk. I also do professional mentoring for developers. You can reach me through my personal website, delacruz.dev or Danny. About my experience with React, I started using React in 2015, before classes were recommended. I don't know if you were there, but you had to use create class, and it was a very convenient function because it made cool things like auto-binding for methods. But then the new ECMA standard came in, and they decided to recommend it to favor familiarity with it. This was the first disruption, and the second disruption is React hooks. I have to confess that I just wanted to do this talk just to use this hook cartoon in a presentation. So challenge accomplished. What I'm going to talk about is not about how do React works or how do React hooks works, because I think this is something you can find anywhere, but more about why I wasn't an early adopter of hooks and my reasons to overcome my first concerns, and also with all these questions that I'm going to be asking myself, some insights and tips and tricks. So the first reason why I was reluctant to start using hooks was because I was in love with higher order components. I loved using this pattern. I thought I didn't need anything else to architecture my applications, and also not so with render pros. That was another pattern that was recommended there, because I have to confess I never understood them. But I was really liking higher order components and the presentational versus container component pattern. So higher order components are just a composition pattern that allows you to wrap your presentational components with the stateful components that encapsulate some logic. In this example, you can see, for example, we've got an HRC that performs a network effect, a network side effect to fetch a list of Pokemons that can be any data that comes from any API or async data source. You can create a higher order component like this, and you can wrap a presentational component that just reacts to a loading state or renders the list of Pokemon after receiving this new browse. This is very straightforward. If we expose this component wrap with our HOC, the user won't notice this implementation data. This was very convenient for keeping presentational components simple and focus on UI, UX changes with stateful logic in just this presentational component. But let's go back to the component again and check what's exactly what we need to isolate from. Why are we using this pattern? the actual piece of business logic inside fetch Pokemon function, that's it. The rest of this function has just React and UI logic, changing the view state from loading to ready. That's it. So is it worth to separate this React component from its own state management? This was one of the questions that were raising in the community before hooks. And this was one of the problems that the community was facing. We were introducing like an artificial abstraction here. Also, another problem that you may end up with using HRCs is that you may have class name collision. For example, I'm running out of my battery on my headset. Sorry for the interruption. You may end up with class name collision. For example, if you have a with mouse and a with scroll, it's very likely that both of them share positions or dimension or x and y props. What happens if one overrides the other one? You cannot fully isolate from these kind of things. Also, some of them might be dependent on each other. You may have with current user that depends on authentication. You cannot have a user without being authenticated. So you are separating things that are tightly related with each other. And also with this pattern that you can see, you end up having what we call the wrapper hell. The wrapper hell is a typical tree on a lot of React applications, and it may end up causing performance issues because React has to evaluate each node of this tree and evaluate if it needs to render or not, even if it's small. If you have a whole application with intermediate nodes that don't render actually anything but have to be executed, it may have an issue, and it's also hard to debug and hard to follow. So these were the problems with HRC that I was in love with. Let's see how hooks come to solve this problem. For example, we can write the same code as before with hooks by creating a custom use Pokemon hooks. Our fetch and loading state management logic are moved there, but it has less to do with UI, and it's easier to test. You can test this very easily with a unit test. With using this hook, you can still keep your component and infrastructure agnostic. You can just use this hook in your presentational component, and it will react to the changes in the loading and Pokemon variable props. So no more class name collisions are happening here, as variables are explicitly declared in the body of the presentational component. And also another advantage is the wrapper hell is gone. You just have one node having all your logic here. So with this insight, I was asking myself, should I stop using HRCs? Well, not. There is not black and white. There is always some gray, some shades of gray in the middle. HRCs are still useful. It's a useful pattern, but you have to use them for more cross-cutting concerns that are shared by all or most of your application views, such as a global state provider, a theme provider, a configuration provider, or things like authentication, authorization, internationalization, and so on. These are cross-cutting concerns. And in these scenarios, higher-order components are still useful. The takeaways or this blog is that hooks solve some of the problems introduced by other patterns or HRCs. Some of these problems are class name collisions, artificial abstractions, and potential performance issues. It is still fine for using them for cross-cutting concerns, such as internationalization or authentication. Another of my concern was what is going to happen to my test? Well, if you are asking also this question, you might be testing implementation details, and this is what we are worrying about. I was worrying about it also. Let's see what I mean with a quick example. Imagine that we got an accordion component and we want to test it. It handles a state variable with an index of the current open element, and it renders an accordion contents for each of its child. Imagine that we want to test it, and we want to test that the internal state variable is set correctly. And we do this with this spec implementation. We can mount the component, check its internal state value, and then use the wrapper instance to set a new value for the state. We finally can check the new value of the state and see if it's correct. If we use Enzyme, for example, Enzyme is a library that encourages us to write tests like this. But what happens if we change the method to change the state variable, or if we change the name of the state variable? Also, does a state variable change guarantee that the user will see a UI change? It doesn't. Also, the following test has some issues. It renders a list of items, but in the expectations, we try to find a component by its internal React component display name. Then we assert it should be in the right position, check its props, but it doesn't ensure that the test will render neither, just that a third-party component is receiving a parameter. We are also testing implementation details here. So let's do it with a simpler example. How can we fix this? The typical counter component, written in the classical way. We could add a specific data test ID attribute, which will only be used for QA and for automated testing. And instead of Enzyme, a library that encourages you to test implementation details, what I recommend to use is a testing library that it helps you to test your UI, avoiding implementation details. It gives you some utility methods to render your components or fire events, and after rendering them, you can target any test ID or things that the user will end up seeing and will end up being rendered on a browser, like this data test ID or HTML tag. Then we can check the actual value of the counter if the counter is updated, but in the HTML, not on an internal state variable. If we write tests like this, we can refactor our previous component with hooks. And just ensuring that we are keeping the data test IDs, our tests are not going to be broken. Our tests are resilient to these changes and to this refactor. And this is why we are writing tests on the first place. So the takeaways are just don't test implementation details and refactor your tests before considering migrating all your components to React hooks. Another one of my concerns was what will happen with my loved should component update and pure component that prevented my components from unexpected re-renders. So there is a short answer to that, and the short answer is that's it. Don't worry too much. The long answer is don't overthink imaginary performance issues. React is designed to render at 60 frames per second, and that's what the virtual DOM is for. There's probably nothing wrong if you let your component render as long as you don't computationally do expensive operations, data fetching, or weird layout effects. And don't overthink it. In any case, measure first, identify which component is causing you trouble, and in case you need it, there are some utilities you can use. For example, in case you need to deal with unwanted render, you can use memo, React memo, or use callback. Let's see some of them. The first one is just use memo. It receives a callback function as a parameter, and it executes only when the dependencies change. It works on a very similar way as useEffect, and you could even replace it with this one as long as you are not using an async operation, because an async operation is a side effect, and it returns the result of executing this callback function. The cool thing is that it won't be executed in subsequent re-renders as long as the dependencies are not changing. Also, you have React memo. It replaces your pure component and your shell component update. It also receives a component as a first parameter. And if you don't do anything else, it will shallow compare your props and decide if it should re-render or not. You can also pass a compare function to it as a second parameter to customize how it takes this decision. You can pass these are equals and compare in a more granular way if the props before and after are changing or not. And for props that you send for typical callback, like on submit, on load, or on anything, you can use callback to ensure that the reference are going to be kept between the renders, because you know that if you render a function and declare an internal function inside the body of this function, it is going to be created every time you render, and the reference is not going to be the same. And React does reference equality. Use callback, ensure that these references are the same between re-renders. So let's skip this block because I'm a bit out of time. Let's go for the most interesting. My last concern or question I had was, do I need Redux with hooks? And the short answer is that you may not, but not because of hooks. You probably didn't need it earlier. React hooks doesn't replace Redux, but Redux offers some things that you might need or not. Let's go to some of the utilities that hooks introduce that made you think that you don't need Redux. In the first place, use context. With use context, you can create a context provider to grab your whole application and provide a global notification system, for example, that reflects the state of your CRUD operation. This context is shared across your whole application. You can create some functions to share there, like on error, on success, on loading, and it will show the right notification every time it's needed. Then in anywhere you need this function, you can grab the whole application with the provider, of course, and then anywhere you need it, you can use them in your component tree. With this context, we have a way of creating like a global or semi-global, because you can do it in anywhere in your component tree. And you got a way to connect to that state. But remember that use context will make your component update every time these functions change. To prevent that, you can grab these callback functions with use callbacks in the provider, or use another alternative and combine it with the use reducer. Imagine that you are a library maintainer, and this library has a form component. It can do several actions, like we were saying before, and it can have an interface like this. A problem with an interface like this is that it doesn't scale. Every time you need to add a new method, you need to change this API and inform your consumers. But you can extract this mutation logic to a reducer, for example, as you will do with Redux, with use reducer, and then use this reducer in your components. This will give you a new state and a dispatch function. What is cool about this dispatch function, in opposition to what we've seen until now, is that by design, dispatch gives you it's a function that keeps the reference between re-renders, and it does it for you. So you don't have to worry about this, and your components won't re-render when you don't want to. So you may think, with use context and use reducer, you can combine this, and there you go. You have Redux. Yes, in most of the cases, but Redux does a lot of things for you that you will probably need to program manually. For example, you might need Redux if you need if your application needs to keep track of every transaction, for example. In Redux, you can do this with middlewares. It is interesting if you need time travel debugging, for example, for storing the exact state when an app crashed and send it to your error tracking tool to reproduce it. Also, if you need a single source of truth for a very complex application state, or if your application is a complex state machine, Redux is a very mature library, very optimized to provide you with methods that in any other case you will need to implement. So in summary, maybe you don't need Redux in your application, maybe you can replace it with hooks, but maybe that's something you could do earlier. Maybe you don't need a global state. But Redux is a very mature library, very well maintained, and that does a lot of cool stuff for you. So I'm going to end up recommending a set of resources. I'm going to share these slides after my talk. These are the articles that helped me the most when starting working with hooks. But what I recommend you is that take your time to understand them before jumping to implement them. This is an article by Dan Abramov, and notice that the estimated time to read it is 49 minutes. Seriously, I'm going to say it again, 49 minutes. This is serious stuff to understand and to deal with. Take your time, make sure you understand them. And I recommend this second article that is Thinking in React Hooks, that is very graphic, very well explained, shorter than Abramov's one. And it personally helped me more than I want to understand them. And as a latest advice, if you have a previously created application, install a Slim plugin React Hooks that will help your IDE a lot when forgetting things like dependencies in FX, use memos, or things like that. So that's it. It was really quick. I'm ready for you to ask me anything.
Thank you very much. So it was really nice. So yes, we do have some questions here. So
Awesome.
The first one is, are there any performance implication of using React hooks?
No, there aren't. The performance implication you may notice is the one I mentioned related with higher order components, because as I said, React needs to evaluate each node of the tree, and if you use a lot of higher order components, it will need to evaluate them, even if only the last one is rendering UI. Some people have done performance measurements with this and argue that it only happens in applications that have an overuse of higher order components, but that's it. The implication that it may have is that naturally you are going to use less code because you are not using classes, you are using functions, and then replacing classes with functions. And less code is less time to evaluate and less effort for the browser. So it's, I would say it's usually an advantage in performance and loading times migrating to hooks.
Great. The second question, it's about context. It says about using context instead of Redux. Aren't we actually going to re-implement Redux? That's the first question. So if you want, go ahead.
Yes. As I said, I don't recommend re-implementing Redux because there is already Redux. There is a lot of people maintaining Redux, and it has like 4 years ago. It's a pretty mature library. Don't overthink it. But what I would like to recommend is that there is a lot of architectural recommendation around using a library like Redux, and it conditions the way you architect your application. So think about if you want this architecture recommendation in your application, because maybe you don't need it. It's easier to include Redux when you realize you need one of its key features than starting with Redux from scratch and then realizing you don't need it, but you can get rid of it because all your architecture is done around using this library.
Okay, so we have more time because you ended like early, so we keep asking the questions here. So that was the first part of the question. There is another part here. It says, okay, aren't we going to couple global state management to React components?
Okay. Global state management, well, one of the things I forgot to say is that for me, React is already a state management library. Using global state or not is should be a business decision. Does your application business needs a global state? Because global state is not good or a good decision by itself and something that fits in any application. The ways to decouple that is to extract the management of the state into reducers, for example, or into functions that just do this transformation. But state is something that is naturally coupled to React because React already manages a state. So what I recommend is to start creating your state closer to where the state is relevant. Use this collocation principle that you can read about, for example, in Kenzie Dodd's blog or other people talking about this. And then in case you realize you need this global state, start promoting it or scaling it or moving it up. But I think trying to do an abstraction early of a global state, for me, it's premature abstraction, and it overcomplicates your application from the beginning when you don't need it.
Okay, perfect. There is another one here. It says,
Sure.
Don't you think that React power at its beginning was the simplicity and that it had been started being overcomplicated during the years?
Yes, I agree. I agree. I remember the time when React was promoted as the B in MVC. It was just a view library. But what happened is that the applications we are building, the web applications we are building, are getting more complex. We are not just building plain views, we are building very complex state machines. And the power of React and the whole ecosystem is the ability to be able to adapt to this. And that's why React is getting more complex. Actually, I first thought that hooks were complicating things. After some time using them, forcing me to use them, I realized that we were solving things in the wrong way because we didn't have the right tools provided by the library to solve them. And I think hooks is a good way to overcome these needs that we had before. So yes, I agree that things are getting more complex, but I think it's a necessary complexity. And the alternative is overcomplicating things with patterns that doesn't really fit in what we are doing.
Great. So 3 minutes left. One question. Next one
Sure.
Is the last one. That's more about your opinion. It says, is it worth updating all components?
As I said, I don't think it's worth to do a massive refactor. I don't recommend that, especially if it's not needed. Do this with a reason. For example, a good reason is that we are using a component library, like, for example, a table component library that updated its version and it just supports hooks now. If you don't want to get out of date using this library, maybe all the components that are used in this table should be migrated to hooks. But rewriting your app just for the sake of doing it is something I don't recommend, because how do you explain this to your product? Hey, we need to stop doing features, we need to stop giving value because we need to refactor this to that, and the only added value we are going to have is maybe some potential performance improvements that are micro optimizations, in my opinion. I think that it's more valuable to measure what parts of your applications are being slow. Perhaps the most slow one is the API. Calling an API is usually in the most optimistic scenario from 100 to 200 milliseconds. Waste your time trying to optimize for that rather than regretting something and share and save some lines of code. Also, remember to refactor your tests before doing a refactor. Make your tests resilient and resilient to this kind of changes and refactors before starting refactoring everything just for the sake of doing it.
Great, Daniel. Thank you very much for your time.
And thank you for organizing.
Let's take a break. Let's take a break for the next one. See you soon then.
Stay home.
Yeah.